It's great to have back on the program Dr. John Gartner, who is the founder of Duty to Warn and former assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University Medical School. It's great to have you back on. I appreciate it.
Great. It's great to be back.
So, you were back in the news over the last week or so with a number of articles quoting your opinions about what is being observed through the publicly available audio and video of President Joe Biden and former
Yeah.
President Donald Trump with regard to potential cognitive issues, dementia, gross dementia, memory loss, age-related decline, etc. So we last had you on a while ago. I don't want to totally retread the perspective you have on the ethics of making these assessments. People like to bring
hmm
up the Goldwater rule, etc. But as we get into this, can you just give us the framework for people to understand the context in which you're making these comments? Neither Trump nor Biden are people you've personally examined in any way.
Sure. Sure. No, absolutely. And actually, I've interviewed a lot of experts in this field, most of whom are unwilling to be quoted on the record. But one of the things they tell me is in clinical practice, most of this diagnosis is made by observation and by just talking to significant others. It's really not as much a clinical interview. And there's other things we use as well that we obviously don't have here, MRIs and neuropsychiatric evaluation. But what we are seeing is a lot of clinical symptoms that we know something about. Even actually, a lot of the average people know a lot about these symptoms because they've had people in their family who've had dementia. The things that Joe Biden is evidencing are things that I evidence. He's been mixed up people's names and mixed up dates. That's pretty much been the gist of it. And you know what? I'm getting to be 66. I mix up people's names. I mix up dates, but I still would rather have me as a psychologist now than the psychologist I was 20 years ago. But you want to talk about memory. The kind of memory problems that Trump is showing are clear signs of dementia. The Dementia Care Society said that when people have dementia, they begin to confuse people and generations, not names and dates, people and generations.
So
So when
talk a
my,
little bit about the difference. So, and we can maybe talk
yeah,
through some examples, with regard to Joe Biden. There was this moment a few weeks ago where he referred to the Mexican president as El Sisi, who of course is not the Mexican president, or times where he seems to kind of mumble and kind of trail off, lose his train of thought, or maybe look maybe disoriented on stage. Talk about that relative to what you observed with Trump.
well, actually, some of these sort of nonverbal things are a little bit hard to characterize. But again, you're talking about the wrong name, the wrong date. I can call my older daughter, my younger daughter, my older daughter's name. Trump actually, on some days, thinks he's running against Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama. And I'm not
Mm.
saying that to be funny. He is actually confusing people. On the stump, he said that he was running against the person who was in charge of security at the Capitol. He said it more than once. In other words, he is actually confusing people. He's not confusing names. And the same thing with, he said 7 times he's running against Barack Obama. Okay, that's not a slip or a gaffe. He
Now
actually, I
he
think,
says
sometimes
that it's
believes that.
satire. He now says it's sarcasm and satire meant to suggest that Obama's really in charge. Do you buy that?
Not in the least. And he's told that lie 1,000 times. Whenever he gets caught, he says he was joking. We know
Mm.
by now that when he says he's joking, he's lying about joking. Joking is the way he covers up his cognitive decline or his other horrible things that he does in plain sight. But it's absolutely never true that he's joking. And by the way, when you look at these clips, he doesn't look like he's joking because one sign of cognitive decline is a lack of awareness that you have cognitive decline. When you are making these mistakes, you don't correct yourself because you're not aware you've made a mistake. Okay. Whereas I think a lot of these name situations, oh no, of course, sorry, the other one, you immediately, he shows no awareness of that. And so that's actually ironically, part of the syndrome.
Is there something that is being said in the media about either Biden or Trump that you think is like flat out inaccurate?
Well, yes, because they basically what's happening is we're being gaslit again, okay, by a kind of whataboutism. The narrative in the media, two old men are running for president. Is either of them really up to it? And there's a certain amount of ageism actually implied in that, meaning that if you're old and you're showing some signs of an aging brain, you're really not up to it. But what I'm saying is we're not making the differential diagnosis between an aging brain and a dementing brain. There's a big difference. Okay. And Trump is showing the kind of confusion, not just of memory, but of language. He's showing a basic breakdown. And this is what all of the experts are telling me in his ability to use language. First of all, we're noticing an enormous regression. This is someone who used to be very articulate with a sophisticated vocabulary, who spoke in complete, polished sentences and paragraphs. Now he has an impoverished vocabulary. He repeats himself and uses superlatives, which are also signs of dementia, and he can't complete a thought or can't even complete a word. And this gets to what I call the neurological smoking gun. Okay. All of the experts I talked to said nobody without brain damage commits these kinds of phonemic paraphasias, which we have dozens of examples of these, blooper reels and whatnot. Instead of saying missiles, he says mishes. Instead of saying Christmas, he says Christus. These are non-words that he's using in place of real words that have the stem of the real word, but he's unable to complete the word. So he just kind of garbles an ending. And there's lots of blooper reels. I think Morning Joe had one, and comedy shows have them of all of his mispronunciations. But it's not a joke. It's hard clinical evidence of brain damage. When I asked these people, do you ever see this in someone who is not brain damaged? They said no.
So let me see if I can get the kind of big picture of what you are observing. On the one hand, we're using Trump's own baseline from the endless hours of prior interviews. You look at interviews from 5 years ago, they're very different. You go back to 10 and 15 years ago with Dave Letterman or whoever, dramatically different. So we're looking at the baseline.
Correct.
You're also looking at the fact that some of these things aren't so much a verbal slip, but they're indicative that he's confused about the subject matter rather than this is a verbal or linguistic element. And then you're also talking about the phonemic paraphasia, the beneficiaries instead of beneficiaries,
right,
or
exactly.
renovation instead of renovation. And then, if I recall correctly, there's the tangential speech. Now, talk a little bit about what that means.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because that is another important component. When people start to become demented, they become more tangential, they ramble, and they go from one sort of unrelated thought to another. Sometimes they kind of tie it together in a made-up story. We call this confabulation. And it's not lying. It's somehow trying to take all these disparate things and make a story out of it. And I'll give you a recent example. When Trump said something about the USS Gerald Ford aircraft carrier, no one knew why he was talking about that. And he said, they're not using the John Deere hydraulics. I don't know what that means, and neither do you. They're using magnets. They're using magnets, he said. They're using magnets. And that's crazy because magnets melt in water. Okay. So when people, and this is what I mean about the press, even the press that picked up on this magnets melt in water comment, right? Actually, you need to hear the whole ramble to really understand how disordered his thinking has become.
In other words, it wasn't just that I don't know that he said the magnets melt, but something like if they get wet, they stop working or something like that.
Or they dissolve.
They dissolve. You're saying it's not just about a misunderstanding of how magnets work. It's that it was sort of like a series of non sequiturs that didn't logically follow from each other.
Correct. And that is a formal thought disorder. That's not that's something that we're trained to assess. Okay. And what I'm saying is the people who are specialists in this area are assessing it. And they're telling me they feel with 95% probability that he has dementia. They just don't want to sign their name to it because they're telling me they might lose their jobs.
Let me ask you about something I've observed casually as the son of a psychiatrist, but not a medical professional myself. There seem to sometimes be two different Trumps, and sometimes we call it high and low energy Trump. Sometimes it's called upper and downer Trump. And sometimes Trump will come out and he seems sped up to some degree. And I observe him doing the tangential speech you just described much more frequently. Other times Trump comes out and he seems almost like depressed, bummed out to be there. He's using a lower tone of voice, speaking very slowly, and seems like he just seems sad and depressed to some degree. Now, obviously, people have different energy levels on different days. You might be in a good mood or a bad mood. Who knows what went on 5 minutes before he went on stage?
No.
But is that in any way relevant to what you're observing or talking about?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the reasons that we're being gaslit is I believe that Trump, and I've written about this, has a hypomanic temperament. So biologically he has a lot of energy. So when he's on, he's charismatic. Shows a bullish kind of energy, and that is part of his charismatic appeal, obviously. But you do see these dramatic changes, and now that I mention this, you will start to notice it. You notice this dramatic change in demeanor, like you described, when he can't find a word. Right before, his eyes go blank, his jaw goes slack. Suddenly he looks confused, and then he talks in a slurred way.
Yeah.
Tries to say the word, and sometimes he tries to say the word several times. Like, again, this weekend he tried to say 3 years later, but he said 3 years lady. It was like an engine with a bad battery trying to turn over. He was just trying to say later, but he kept saying lady, and it was slurring while he was saying it. So in other words, look, just like people with Alzheimer's have sundowning, right? They can be fine at 1 p.m, and then at 5 they're off the hook, okay, and disoriented. Okay, he becomes momentarily disoriented, and you can see it in his whole demeanor. And so now that I mentioned, it's not just the slip of the, not just that he's not using the word. You can literally see the lights are out mentally. Someone has pulled the plug, and he is not there.
When it comes to the Joe Biden stuff, it seems to me that in general, if you have someone who's in their 80s running the country, it makes sense to have a backup plan and to know exactly what happens if X, Y, or Z. Now, with presidents, we know that there's a vice president, and then we have the Speaker of the House, et cetera. Increasingly, there's a discussion from some about Joe Biden might not make it to November. And what do we do? What does the Democratic Party do? Because there isn't really a primary being run, et cetera. From a strictly actuarial perspective, does it seem logical to you, at least for the Democratic Party, to have an answer to that question?
You know, I think the Democratic Party is very bad at politics.
True.
And I think that I would actually disagree with you, and I would take an opposite tack. I think
Really?
we need to take, in the sense that instead of answering that question, we need to reassure the people that Joe Biden is here. I think he's running sort of a Rose Garden campaign, and he needs to show us Uncle Joe. Okay, we need to feel like we know him, like he's with us. I don't care if he commits a gaffe. I don't care if he gets someone's name wrong. We don't need to be hit, but we need to know he's with us and he's here. He's actually doing a good job, by the way.
I agree with that. I agree with that for sure.
And people actually, again, sort of, I say to people, look, I mess up patients' appointments now. I never used to do that. I used to have it all in my head, and I'm calling someone up. Hey, Joe, where are you? Dr. Gartner, I told you we're not meeting this week. Didn't you remember? Oh, sorry. Meanwhile, I'd rather have me as a psychologist now than the me of 20 years ago, because I'm wiser. Okay. And so the point is, yeah, or maybe Joe has because he's a normal president, he's got an army of advisors and technocrats, right, backing him up and giving him options and helping to structure and organize his day and his decision-making process. That team is in place. He's using it well, and he's using his judgment and his wisdom and his humanity to make good decisions. Okay. That's really yes, anyone can die. That would be really messed up. But I think there's really a way in which the press is really committing a kind of ageism. Yes, I get it. His voice is a little raspy. He's got apparently muscle tension, from his, he recently had a White House physical. He doesn't walk with a lot of, limber sort of energy. Apparently he's got some muscle stiffness. Meanwhile, the guy still tries to ride his bike at the Delaware National Park. God bless him. He's not, don't count him out. I think we need to see him in. That's my personal opinion. I don't know the answer to the constitutional question that you're.
Do you agree that? And by the way, I'm essentially seeing this the way that you are. Do you agree that there's some superficial way? You mentioned the raspy voice and the moving around, maybe with a lack of effervescence and this sort of thing. Do you agree that the picture of it all sometimes gives the superficial impression that Trump actually is, quote, healthier. And I know that that's such a fraught term because are we talking about mental health, cardiovascular health? What are we talking about? Do you see
Energy. He's got a
how
lot of energy.
you see how someone could see the two and say Trump seems healthier?
That's why the doctors need to speak.
Mm.
That's what I'm trying to explain, is that if you're not trained, you don't know that a phonemic paraphasia is a neurological smoking gun. What you know is what you see. And so if one guy looks a little slower or talks a little more raspier, he looks like he's got less ability. But what we have is a whole, basically, it's like the man who would be emperor has a broken brain, and
Mm.
all of the people see it and know it, but the people who have the authority to say it aren't saying it because of things like the Goldwater rule. It's really interesting. There's a different atmosphere now than there was in 2018. A lot of the people that spoke out in 2018 are afraid to speak out now.
And what is
Because,
it exactly they're afraid of?
well, one of them has already told me his promotion's been held up because of his past Trump activities.
Huh.
The thing is that when we first came out, who are we defying? The American Psychiatric Association? What are they going to do to us? People say, you're so brave, Dr. Gardner, to speak out. No, I'm not. I don't even work for Hopkins anymore. They can't even fire me.
But
But
what's
what's happening
changed
now is
now? Yeah.
what's changed now is people feel like this politically violent, repressive regime could take over. And there's an
Mm.
atmosphere of reprisal and revenge, and also kind of an ethos that that's okay. That maybe your boss might feel that he could take revenge, because that's the new thing you're supposed to do to the people who, say bad things about the dear leader.
That is chilling, for lack of a better term, and hopefully, at least, we will get a more precise coverage of this from corporate media between now and November, if nothing else. Although I'm not super optimistic, I have to admit.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I'm sort of getting out here and saying all this is because uh, we need to get that message into the mainstream media.
Right.
Because right now the narrative is just that they've got this, both sidism, two old men narrative down pat. And actually, there's also a disproportionate way that they edit the tape. They focus so much on every stumble or malapropism of Biden's, but then they edit it out. The mad rambling rants. So if he has a rally and 5 minutes of it is incomprehensible, that's actually the most important 5 minutes.
Right, the whole thing, yeah. Well, it doesn't fit into corporate media isn't going to run a 5-minute portion of the speech that you would need to understand the rambling context. They just don't do that. They want 15 seconds.
Well, even yeah, right. So part of it, you're right, is the time limit. But they rarely show you'll see it on late night television. You'll see it on Twitter,
Yeah.
but you won't see it on the 6 o'clock news. But that's the headline. The man who's running for president is unable to use English coherently.
Right. Wow. We've been speaking with Dr. John Gartner, founder of Duty to Warn and former assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University Medical School. Always great having you on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.